For most of the 19th century, Britain looked like the final boss of history. It ruled the seas, its flag flew on every continent, its currency, the pound sterling, acted as the world's money. By 1914, a quarter of the world's population lived under the British Crown. London was the financial capital of the planet. If you had asked almost anyone which empire would still be on top in 100 years, the safe bet was Britain. And then, in the space of just a few decades, something strange happened. Britain won 2 world wars, but after each victory it was weaker. By the 1950s and 60s, the empire was dissolving, the pound was under constant pressure, and the country that had once dominated the world was negotiating its place in an order designed by someone else. How does that happen? How do you win the biggest wars in history and still lose your empire? This is the story of how Britain tried to fight history with prestige, with the pound, and with borrowed time, and why that pattern feels uncomfortably familiar today. To understand the collapse, we have to start at the peak. In the late 1800s, Britain sits at the center of a global system that feels permanent. It is the workshop of the world, exporting coal, steel, textiles, and machines. The British Navy controls the main sea lanes. Insurance, shipping, and banking all flow through London. The British Empire isn't just land and flags, it's an infrastructure of power, telegraph cables, coaling stations, ports, and trading posts that tie vast regions of the world into one network. At the core of that network is the pound sterling. Foreign governments, merchants, and investors trust the pound more than almost any other asset. It is backed by gold, supported by London's banks, and reinforced by the Royal Navy's control of trade routes. If you live in Canada, India, South Africa, or Australia, Britain is not just a faraway island. It is the place your currency references, your trade settles, and your elites imitate. And because this system works so smoothly, it creates an illusion that Britain can always afford to police the seas, arbitrate disputes, and intervene wherever it chooses, that it can act as the world's manager, almost by default. But under the surface, something else is forming. The more Britain tries to stabilize everything, everywhere, the more it ties its fate to a system that requires perfect control and perfect timing. That system is about to be stress-tested in the worst possible way. The first great rupture is the First World War. For decades, Britain tries to maintain a balance of power in Europe. No single continental empire should dominate. But when the crisis of 1914 spirals into total war, Britain is pulled into a conflict far larger and more expensive than anything it has faced before. The British Empire can mobilize soldiers, resources, and ships from around the world. On paper, this looks like the ultimate test and proof of imperial strength. But modern industrial war has a different kind of cost. To pay for the guns, shells, ships, and food needed to sustain the war, Britain doesn't just reach into its own pockets, it borrows heavily, especially from the United States. Gold flows out of London, foreign assets are sold, debts accumulate. By the time the war ends in 1918, Britain is technically on the winning side. Germany is defeated. New territories are placed under British and French control. And yet, beneath the victory parades, the balance sheet has flipped. Britain has gone from being one of the world's largest creditors to one of its largest debtors. The pound is still a global currency. The empire is still geographically huge. But a new power, America, has become the main supplier of credit and industrial capacity. Instead of asking what this means, Britain makes a critical choice. It decides that what matters most is not adjusting to a new reality, but restoring the old symbols of strength. In the 1920s, the British government makes a defining decision to put the pound back on the gold standard at its pre-war value. On the surface, this looks like a return to normal. The message to the world is clear: The pound is as good as it ever was. Britain is back. But underneath, the world has changed. The war has left Britain with high debts, an aged industrial base, and fierce new competitors. Trying to force the pound back to its old parity means forcing the economy to fit a number that belongs to another era. Exports become more expensive. Factories struggle to compete. Workers face wage cuts and unemployment. The decision is defended as sound money and honouring Britain's prestige. But in practice, it means protecting the symbol of strength while letting the real industrial base weaken. A familiar pattern appears. The empire is willing to sacrifice the living economy to defend an image of the pound, instead of adjusting the pound to match the real economy. The interwar years become a slow grind of strikes, austerity, and political tension. And while Britain struggles to reconcile past glory with present reality, another crisis is building. The Second World War explodes this fragile balance. Once again, Britain enters the war to prevent a hostile power from dominating Europe. Once again, it mobilizes the empire, troops, resources, bases from around the world. But by 1939, the empire is not entering the war from the same position of financial strength. It is already burdened with debt, already struggling to maintain global commitments. This time, the cost will be even higher. To keep fighting after 1940, Britain depends heavily on American support, first through arrangements like Lend-Lease, then through direct borrowing. Factories are bombed, cities are damaged, foreign investments are liquidated. By 1945, the war is technically won. Nazi Germany is defeated, Japan surrenders, Britain stands in the line of victors. But the bill for victory is catastrophic. The empire is financially exhausted. It owes massive sums to the United States. Its industries are worn out. Rationing continues into the late 1940s. At the same time, a new economic order is being designed, one in which the United States, not Britain, will provide the anchor. At Bretton Woods, the global financial system is reorganized around the US dollar. The pound is still important, but it is no longer the unquestioned center. Once again, Britain must choose between adapting its role or pretending it can keep playing the same game with fewer pieces. It chooses the illusion. After the war, British leaders try to do three things at once. They want to maintain a global military presence and imperial influence. They want to build a modern welfare state at home, healthcare, education, social safety nets. And they want to defend the pound's prestige as a major international currency. All three goals are politically popular. All three are understandable, but together they are extraordinarily expensive. There is a way to pay for this: growth, efficiency, and hard choices about which commitments to keep. Instead, Britain leans on something easier in the short term: borrowing, both at home and from abroad. The empire begins to dissolve on paper. India becomes independent. Other colonies move towards self-rule. But in practice, the British state still acts as if it can project force and shape events far beyond its shrinking economic base. The turning point comes in 1956, during the Suez Crisis. When Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launch a military operation to retake control. The plan is based on an old assumption that Western military force can simply reassert its interests and the financial system will adjust. But the post-war world is different. The United States is not willing to back the operation. As markets react and pressure on the pound mounts, Washington has a simple tool. It can threaten to withhold support and let sterling fall. Faced with a potential financial crisis, Britain backs down. Suez becomes more than a failed operation. It is a moment of revelation, an empire behaving as if it still sets the rules, discovering that its currency and credit now depend on someone else's approval. From that point on, the pattern is harder to ignore. In the decades that follow, Britain goes through a series of currency crises and painful adjustments. The pound is devalued, inflation flares, governments of different parties promise renewal, but run into the same structural limits. The country is still rich. London remains a major financial centre. Britain still has nuclear weapons, a seat on the UN Security Council, and cultural influence far beyond its size. On the surface, the trappings of great power are still there. But underneath, the direction has shifted. Industrial capacity shrinks. Regions outside the financial core decline. The currency is no longer a rock. It is something that has to be defended, managed, and sometimes sacrificed. By the late 20th century, Britain is no longer the manager of a global system. It is a significant player inside a system built on American power and the US dollar. The empire did not vanish in a single moment. It dissolved through a series of decisions about wars, money, prestige, and denial. When you step back, the pattern looks familiar. So what is that pattern? First, a long period of dominance, economic, military, and monetary. Then a belief that this dominance is self-reinforcing, that the empire can police the system because the system needs the empire. Then a shock, world wars, systemic crises that force the empire to spend more than it can easily afford. To avoid choosing between guns, welfare, and global status, it turns to debt and to the symbolic defense of its currency. The empire starts fighting for its image, for the idea of an unshakable pound, for the prestige of being everywhere, even as its real industrial and social base weakens. Eventually, a moment arrives, like Suez, when financial dependence and political reality collide. The empire discovers that it cannot act as it used to without triggering a crisis it cannot contain. After that, the rest is not an explosion, but a long unwinding, a series of smaller crises, adjustments, and concessions that slowly redefine the country's role. Britain did not fall into a crater. It stepped down, step by step, under pressures that were building for decades. It is tempting to treat this as a closed chapter, a historical curiosity about sterling and the sunset of the British Empire. But the pattern is larger than one country. Whenever a state controls the key trade routes, holds the top currency, and carries global military commitments, it faces the same temptations to treat its money as a symbol that must never be allowed to weaken, even if that means hurting its own workers, to finance wars and promises with credit, assuming its status will always attract new lenders, to cling to the appearance of power even as the underlying capacity shifts somewhere else. In the 19th century, Britain built and rode this pattern. In the 20th century, it paid the price for not adjusting in time. Today, another country issues the world's reserve currency, another navy patrols the key sea lanes, another capital city sits at the center of global finance. The details are different, the technologies are different, but the basic questions are surprisingly similar. How long can a system built on debt, prestige, and inherited advantage sustain itself? What happens when the bill for winning comes due? On this channel, we are not predicting the exact date or shape of anyone's collapse. We are tracking the pattern, from Spain's silver to Britain's pound, from the Soviet Union's planned economy to modern dollarized finance. We are following the same curve through different empires, different currencies, and different illusions. If you want to see where that curve might be pointing next, not in headlines, but in historical echoes, subscribe to Collapse Pattern. Don't just watch history happen, see it coming.